Ladies and gentlemen, there have been a whole host of Donald Trump-related books released recently. As a matter of fact, you know that this week I interviewed Robert Costa. He is the co-author of one of those books. It happens to be the hottest book in the country, Peril. He wrote it with Bob Woodward. You can go to my YouTube page and you can watch the interview that I conducted with Bob. I think I was able to break new ground. I had initially been disappointed because I thought I was at the bottom end of the totem pole. He'd been everywhere, interviewed by everyone. What was going to be left for me to ask? And yet I'm the guy who actually read the book. But I was dealt a good hand insofar as Bob Costa was my guest one day after General Milley testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. So there was a lot of grist for that mill. If you thought, okay, now we've heard the whole story about the latter days of the Trump administration, it turns out we haven't. There is one more book, well, more than one, I'm sure, but there's one more book that I'm keenly interested to read, and it's Stephanie Grisham's book. You'll remember that Stephanie Grisham was briefly the White House press secretary. She worked in the Trump White House for several years. Very clever title, I'll Take Your Questions Now, which is a play on the fact that when she was White House press secretary, she never took questions from the press. She never had a press conference, as I recall. But now she'll take your questions. I don't want to overstate this, but I've met and spent time with Stephanie Grisham, which is part of the reason that I'm interested in reading her book. I had one White House meeting with President Donald Trump, and I remember it very well. It was on Monday, September 9 of 2019. If you could put that in some context. Frankly, it's a time period when there was a lot going on relative to Ukraine. If I went back, I could reconstruct the timeline. On the day that I saw President Trump, there was some critical telephone call that was made. I didn't have an appointment with Trump necessarily. I remember it well. I was in Washington that Sunday speaking to a private group. In fact, truth be told, they were dermatologists. It stands out in my mind because they all had good skin.
It's amazing, isn't it? Right.
So I spoke to a group of dermatologists on a Sunday night at the Willard. And then I stayed overnight and I did my SiriusXM radio program with Dan at the SiriusXM DC headquarters. And I then had a 1 o'clock or thereabout appointment with Stephanie Grisham in the White House, the purpose of which was to introduce myself to her and to request guests, including him. You know, I wanted on POTUS, never made it happen, but I wanted the president on POTUS. And we were having a very pleasant conversation in the West Wing, just the two of us. She looked down at her computer. She said, he knows you're here and he wants to see you. And the next thing I remember, I'm in the Oval Office. Stephanie is there. No one else is present. We're waiting for the president to come in from his anteroom. He did. I ended up having a 12 or 15-minute one-on-one conversation. She remained in the room, but she sort of receded into the drapes. And I had a very interesting off-the-record encounter with President Trump. Then he was leaving for an event. I walked out and was in the midst of the press corps, didn't ask any questions, took in the whole scene, went back to Philly. What stands out in my mind is somehow, like, what do you talk about when you're standing in the Oval Office with the White House press secretary, waiting for the president and just wanting to make stupid talk? We talked about our dogs. And I remember she showed me on her phone a French bulldog that she had just acquired. And oddly, interestingly, my wife had just sold a home to one of the 76ers. I forget which. I don't think I told you this part before. And the 76er had a litter of French bulldogs
and hadn't said who it was.
And offered one to my wife, which we thought was like really cool. But the price tag was like double digits.
Oh, yeah.
That was the end of the French bulldog.
But you guys were looking around for puppies then, right? Or
I never thought they were that attractive anyway.
French bulldogs?
No.
Oh, they're so cute.
Anyway, so there, you've all learned something. Stephanie Grisham has a bulldog.
French bulldog.
French bulldog. So I've just given you the background as to why when the tidbits began to come out about her forthcoming book, I paid extra attention. Like, hey, I know her. She was nice to me. In fact, she was very complimentary and said to me, no, I'll keep that under wraps. But she suggested to me that I was probably the only person that would be seriously considered for interviews. They were then considering it. Hey, we think you're fair. That's what she said.
Okay.
We think you're fair.
Okay.
He often doesn't like what you say, but more than others, how's that? He thinks you're fair.
Correct.
Okay. So now come the tidbits about her book. For example, Politico had a piece. I think this was the first one that I had seen. Yeah, here it is. More stories based on former White House press secretary Stephanie Grisham's book are now emerging. This is about a week old. The New York Times' Katie Rogers has plenty of details from Grisham on Trump sexually objectifying a young press aide, quote, whom Miss Grisham says the president repeatedly invited up to his Air Force One cabin, including once to, quote, look at her using an expletive to describe her rear end. Melania Trump's rage after Stormy Daniels' news, Trump's desire to evict the press permanently from the White House, and Jared Kushner, whom Grisham calls Rasputin in a slim-fitting suit, plus an appearance by the song Memory from Cats. So I read Katie Rogers' story. In other words, this is a 352-page book of the sort that those who get advance copies quickly go online and say, here are the tidbits. Here are the tidbits. So, for example, in the New York Times, Katie Rogers' tidbits about the forthcoming Grisham book had subheadlines, a fleetingly tough stance toward Putin is just for show. And you've probably heard this story now where Trump supposedly says to Putin, hey, I'm going to act like a tough guy, then we'll do some business. This was the meeting where Putin brings a very attractive woman as a translator so as to distract Trump. Genius, by the way, on Putin's part. Sexist language toward women, Melania Trump's quiet rebellion, demands to evict the press from the White House, yada, yada, yada. Those were the initial tidbits that came from Stephanie Grisham's forthcoming book. Now, today, Politico magazine has an excerpt of the book, and this is fascinating. So in Politico magazine, you can read like an entire chapter of Stephanie Grisham's book. Let me just tell you the way that it begins. I think you'll be quite interested. The year 2020 started on a promising enough note for the president, at least considering all we'd endured the previous 3 years. The economy was good. The impeachment effort on Ukraine looked like a dud, and polls were decent. Trump was, for the most part, in a good mood and, as always, up for chatting about anything under the sun. Once on Air Force One, I was sitting with him in his cabin, and for whatever reason, maybe he had just read something or seen his face on TV, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau popped into the president's head. Trump looked at me. Are you okay if I say this? That was always a troubling question. Who knew what was going to come out of his mouth? Sure, I nodded. Well, Trudeau's mom, this is President Trump speaking, Trudeau's mom, she effed all of the Rolling Stones. In fact, Margaret Trudeau denied having affairs with any members of the Rolling Stones, but later said, I should have slept with every single one of them. I guess Trump mixed that up. She said she should have slept with them. Trump said, well, she did. She did.
The lady doth protest too much.
Another one. I mean, I have to tell you, I'm so superficial. I'm a sucker for every one of these type of stories.
And they ring true, having spoken to him.
No doubt. No doubt. On another occasion, around the new year, a young boy started publicly challenging Trump to go vegan in TV ads and on highway billboards. If the president agreed, the boy said, the charity he represented would donate $1 million to veterans. I was communications director at the time, and I playfully asked the president if he would ever consider doing that, since the challenge would raise a lot of money for a good cause. I knew he loved his steaks and cheeseburgers, but 1 month didn't seem that long. Trump's response was swift, and his tone was suddenly very serious. No, this is Trump on being a vegan. It messes with your body chemistry, your brain, he said, offering his views on vegetarian diets. And if I lose even one brain cell, we're all effed. definitely could see him saying
Oh
that. And there's so much more to Stephanie Grisham, as this excerpt today from Politico magazine reveals, including like a nice summation paragraph where she describes what it was like to work in the White House. Oh, here it is. Working as Trump's spokesperson was like sitting in a beautiful office while a sprinkler system pours water down on you every second and ruins everything on your desk. I'm sure that's exactly the way that it happened. But there's a story that she tells in the book that I absolutely don't believe. And I don't think she's lying, but I just do not believe this happened. CNN was the first to publish this, and here it is. Headline: Trump's former press secretary details his mysterious 2019 hospital visit in behind-the-scenes look at his White House. Grisham served as press secretary, chief of staff to Melania, East Wing communications director, before resigning after the January 6th riot. She gives a firsthand account of her time in the White House and describes a culture of lies in the Trump administration. And then this very key paragraph in the book: Grisham does not use the term colonoscopy, but heavily implies that's what the trip was for. She says Trump's hospital visit, which stirred weeks-long speculation about his health, was a, quote, very common procedure during which a patient is put under. She also writes that former President George W. Bush had a similar procedure while in office. Bush had multiple colonoscopies during his time in office. Grisham writes that Trump did not want Vice President Mike Pence to be in power while he was sedated, which was part of the reason he kept his visit private. He also did not want to be the butt of a joke on late night television, writes Grisham. The episode is just one of several behind the scenes revelations by Grisham, who was one of Trump's longest serving staffers and witnessed blah, 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 blah. In other words, the account here is that he had a colonoscopy without anesthesia. And I say, to quote him talking about the Rolling Stones, no effing way. There's no way that I believe he has it in him.
Come on.
To have a colonoscopy.
Yeah, but you can
without anesthesia.
Okay.
She may think he did. He may have lied about it to be a tough guy. I'm asserting the following thesis.
Oh boy.
Speculation.
The colonoscopy thesis? Go.
Yes,
go
colonoscopy gate. I believe he may have been put under without notification of Pence, so that Pence could be the acting president for a couple of minutes' time. That's my theory.
But then he would have had to have people, a lot of people would have to be in that loop, right? In other words,
the doctors.
No, the people, the people around him would have had to know that.
Whoever performed the colonoscopy.
You think that just the doctors would know whether the president was put under or not?
To be fair, by the way, the former President Trump says, too bad all that sleazebag publishers continue to report this very boring garbage. I beg to differ on the latter part. We at the MAGA movement are totally used to it. Melania Trump also trashed the book, gave a statement to the Washington Post. The intent behind the book is obvious. It's an attempt to redeem herself after a poor performance as press secretary. So they're all denying it.
Okay.
But here's what it brings to my mind. Let me just tell you what popped into my head when I hear the claim that Trump had a colonoscopy without anesthesia. I immediately think of James Frye. Does anybody remember what was it called? A Million Little Pieces, the book that came out in 2003. I remember this all so well. It was a book club selection for my wife's book club. She turned me on to it. I'm embarrassed to say I was totally taken in.
Alone. Don't be embarrassed by that.
The whole country was taken in.
Oprah was taken in.
I'm going to get to that. Just to remind everybody, Fry was a guy who tells this story in A Million Little Pieces about his battle with addiction. It was an Oprah book club selection. That's what made it a bestseller. To be fair, the book was questioned from Jump Street by one of the media outlets in Minnesota, but the rest of us were all taken in by his remarkable story. And then all of a sudden, it was the smoking gun. It was the smoking gun in 2006 that blew apart his story. He had said that he was in jail for 87 days. They actually got a police report, and it said that he'd been detained for 5 hours. And that was then the beginning of the unraveling of James Frey. I have no idea whatever happened to him. My recollection is that even after he was revealed to be a fraud, he got a huge book deal. But why do I bring up James Frey in the context of whether Donald Trump had a colonoscopy without anesthesia? I bring it up for this reason, because one of the most memorable aspects of the book for me was him talking about having root canal without Novocaine. And I remember being on the radio and saying, like, oh my God, is that even possible? And the reason that he said he had no Novocaine is because he was in treatment, and that there was no way he could be given Novocaine because that would put him back on his path of addiction. So when everything hits the fan, and this is a remarkable story, but I don't want to get too sidetracked on it, but I remember a very famous Larry King interview where James Frey was there, I think with his mother. And then Oprah called in at the end of the show, and she like let him off the hook when I wanted her to hammer him because he'd led her and a lot of us astray. Then he did an interview with Oprah, James Frey, and I have a transcript of it. And Oprah says this: I want to move on to the dentist story, because anybody who's read the book, when you get to the story of him going to the dentist and you describe having 2 root canals without Novocaine or anesthesia, so graphic, so detailed, you say, quote, my face is on fire. The veins in my neck are exploding. My brain is white. And you describe the white hot pain. And when I first saw you, that's the first thing I asked you about. That's unbelievable. And now you said that was true. Would you say it today? And James Frey, when confronted by Oprah, goes on to say, well, I really don't know whether that happened. I remember being on the radio at the time, and I remember believing that people in my audience who called me, and this goes back more than 15 years, had root canal without Novocaine. And I believe, I'm not going to do it, but I believe if I open my telephone lines on that issue right now, people would call and they would explain to me why it was necessary without Novocaine. But there's just no way Donald Trump had a colonoscopy without anesthesia. And I want to tell you that the only person that I know who absolutely had a colonoscopy without anesthesia, I hope this is not a HIPAA violation, is a physician who is the friend and former colleague of a very good friend of mine. And I remember this story. I remember so many aspects of the story. These two guys are both brilliant surgeons. One of them is my friend Todd Albert, who was the chairman of the Rothman Institute in Philadelphia and was the chairman of the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. I mean, world class. And his former colleague, also a spine surgeon, named Pete Sharkey. Let me tell you one story about these two. They both lived in the inner rim of suburban Philadelphia's main line. And there was a time period, Todd, I remember telling me this story, Dr. Albert, where they would go to work together. Here was their commute. They had one bike between them, and the trip into the city was about 10 miles, a hilly 10 miles.
A significant 10 miles.
And yeah, a significant, because it's not a flat 10 miles.
Yes.
Okay. So the one bike, they would go for 5 minutes of one guy running, not jogging, running, and the other guy on a bike. And then after 5 minutes, they'd swap. And now you became the rider and the other guy became the sprinter. This is how they would probably at 5 a.m.
That's insane.
And then they would have a full slate of cases of, very sophisticated surgeries one day they were pedaling through Fairmount Park, going to work at 5 a.m. to the Rothman Institute. And there was a problem in the park at the time with, would you say feral if it's a dog? Feral, or does that only apply to a cat?
No, I think feral dogs.
How about this? How about this? There were wild dogs that lived together in Fairmount Park.
So there was a pack of feral dogs.
They got attacked by feral dogs.
Ooh.
They got attacked by feral
And they
dogs.
only had one bike.
Right. And only one guy was on the bike. And Todd, I don't know about Pete, but Todd had to get rabies shots.
Oh, of course.
From being attacked by dogs.
Yeah.
So these are two guys who are like high flyers, he-men, macho. When Pete needed a colonoscopy, so the story goes, he said, I have 5 kids, and I am not willing to take the 1 in 250,000 chance that I might die from this routine procedure.
This is how you want your doctor to think.
So I want a tough guy doctor. This would be my guy.
Oh, great. Let me operate on your spine without anesthesia.
So I am not having anesthesia for my colonoscopy, not for any medical reason, but because he had 5 kids and he didn't want any risk whatsoever. So I was going to say, laid there he laid there and he took it like a man.
Okay. Can I just ask you though?
Pete, my final thought.
Yes.
I believe Pete Sharkey had a colonoscopy without anesthesia because he was the type of man who would ride a bike and do like a triathlon on the way to work and get attacked by wild dogs. But do not try and convince me that Donald Trump had a colonoscopy without anesthesia.
Okay. As usual, though, I believe you are giving yourself away because I remember, and everybody who is listening remembers, the countdown to your first colonoscopy, which was insane. It was like, it's a year away. And then it was like, it's 6 months away. It was like the worst thing you could possibly imagine. So the thought for you of having a colonoscopy without anesthesia, I believe to be a terrifying prospect. But I think there are people that have a colonoscopy without general anesthesia and just get a sedative. And if Trump were to have just gotten a sedative, he wouldn't have been totally knocked out and wouldn't have had to told Pence. So I bet that's what he did.
Okay. That's your story.
That's my story. And because you can't even picture it.
My story is he got knocked out and nobody knew because he didn't want to appear weak and he didn't want Pence to be president even for 30 seconds. That's your story. And that's my story. So I believe Stephanie Grisham when she says that Donald Trump told her the story about Margaret Trudeau. I believe that happened. I believe everything else I've read in terms of the tidbits of the book. And Stephanie wouldn't know. She wasn't there.
Say, she thought.
No, she's
under. Right.
I'm sure he probably wanted people to believe that he'd had a colonoscopy with that because he's a he-man. Oh my God. But I'm telling you, there's just no way.
Not in your world. No
way. Trump might be a bigger man than yours truly, but he did not have a colonoscopy without anesthesia. Okay? That's my story, ladies and gentlemen. That is what I wanted to convey to all of you.